The air above King's Landing reeked of burning oil, ash, and blood. But unlike the real battle we once knew, where wildfire turned the tide in the Lannisters' favour, this time the flames had failed. The wildfire stores, carefully placed beneath Blackwater Bay, had been sabotaged. A spy from Dragonstone had slipped into the pyromancer's ranks days before the battle. Instead of burning Stannis' fleet, the explosion turned inward, igniting Lannister ships and panicking their own men. Half of King's Landing's navy turned to cinders before they even saw the enemy's sails. By the time Stannis Baratheon's soldiers stormed the mud gate, the gold cloaks had scattered, the small folk were rioting, and the Red Keep stood vulnerable like a heart without armour. Cersei Lannister, dressed in black, sat in the throne room with her youngest son, Tommen, clutched in her arms. Joffrey had fled the battlefield the moment the fire turned against them, and now no one knew where he was. Ser Lancel had tried to stop her from pouring poison into Tommen's wine, but he was too weak from his wounds. The Queen would rather see her son dead than under the rule of Stannis. The doors to the throne room burst open as flames from the outer halls cast long shadows across the floor. Sir Davos Seaworth entered first, sword raised, followed by dozens of Baratheon men with black stags on gold. Behind them walked Stannis, his face stained with soot, his eyes burning with justice and rage. Beside him, Melisandre, her red gown trailing behind like fire itself, whispered words only he could hear. Cersei looked up with dead eyes, clutching Tommen's lifeless body. Her lips trembled, not with fear, but with hatred. "You were too late," she hissed. Stannis didn't flinch. He looked past her at the Iron Throne. For a long moment he said nothing. "You are not fit to rule," Melisandre said quietly, stepping forward. "The Lord of Light saw this city fall in flames long before you lit them." Cersei stood up slowly, her dress wet with her son's blood. "And you think fire makes you king? You will find only corpses in this castle." Before Stannis could speak, one of his men raised his sword. Cersei didn't scream. She didn't beg. She only smiled as the steel met her neck. Outside, the streets of King's Landing had become a war zone of vengeance. The small folk, tired of starvation and cruelty, joined the invading soldiers. Lannister banners were torn down and burned. Anyone wearing red and gold was hunted. The nobles who once laughed at beggars were now hiding in cellars like rats. Tyrion Lannister was found barely breathing in a collapsed tower, half his face split open from a wild swing during the chaos. Maester Frenken begged for his life and carried him away before Stannis' men reached the chamber. Varys disappeared without a trace, whispering last words into the ears of servants before vanishing like a shadow. Rumours said he fled to Essos. Others claimed he was already plotting in Stannis' own court. When Tywin Lannister finally arrived at King's Landing with the Tyrell forces, it was far too late. The gates were sealed, the walls lined with Baratheon archers, and the Red Keep bathed in red not from banners, but blood. Tywin saw his daughter's body strung from the same balcony where Joffrey once mocked the people. His army froze in horror, and for the first time in decades, Tywin Lannister did not give a command. He simply turned his horse and rode away in silence. Stannis sat the Iron Throne that night, not with cheers, but silence. No one dared speak as Melisandre placed a hand on his shoulder. "The rightful king has returned," she said. But in the cold silence of that throne room, the shadows seemed to whisper a different truth, one of fire, vengeance, and a kingdom ruled not by justice, but fear. The news of King's Landing's fall spread through Westeros like wildfire that didn't need pyromancers to burn. For the first time in living memory, the Lannisters had lost. And not just a battle. They'd lost the capital, the crown, and the illusion of invincibility that had shielded them for decades. In Harrenhal, word reached Robb Stark as he sat sharpening his sword under dim torchlight. He didn't celebrate, he didn't smile, he only nodded slowly, understanding that the game had shifted entirely. Stannis Baratheon now sat the Iron Throne, but Robb knew better than to think he'd be an ally to the north. If anything, Stannis' justice would come for him next. The traitor's son wouldn't be spared, no matter how noble his cause. But for now it was Tywin Lannister who had to reckon with the loss. The Lord of Casterly Rock rode west with his remaining host, nearly 20,000 strong, but every mile felt heavier than the last. His daughter's death haunted him, not because he mourned her, but because her loss humiliated him. Tywin Lannister did not forgive humiliation. He counted every failure as a debt to be paid in blood. And so, as he passed through the Riverlands, Tywin didn't mourn. He didn't retreat. He schemed. He summoned envoys to the Reach, proposing a new alliance not with King's Landing, but against it. If the Tyrells could no longer marry into the throne, perhaps they could help tear it down. Margaery Tyrell was now without a royal husband, and Tywin offered them something far more tempting than a crown: revenge. Back in the ruined capital, Stannis ruled like stone, cold, silent, unforgiving. He ordered every remaining Lannister knight to be executed, publicly. Their heads lined the city gates. Even the youngest squires weren't spared. Stannis believed in law, not mercy. Sansa Stark was found alive in her quarters, locked away by Cersei before the battle. She expected death when the guards dragged her through the corridors. But Melisandre looked upon her with narrowed eyes and said, "She has the blood of wolves. There is power in her." Instead of killing her, they kept her in the Red Keep, under constant watch. Melisandre spent long hours speaking with her, asking strange questions about her dreams, her gods, her family. Sansa didn't trust the Red Woman, but she didn't resist. She'd learned from Cersei how to survive behind smiles and silence. Tyrion, meanwhile, woke up days later in a dark room beneath the city. His head wrapped in linen, his mouth dry as sand. It was Varys who had saved him. The spider had not fled, not yet. He watched from the shadows as the city burned, as kings died, and as new ones rose. Varys understood something no one else did. Power is a shadow, and shadows can change shape. "You are still useful," Varys whispered. "Perhaps more now than ever." Tyrion tried to laugh, but pain tore through his ribs. He couldn't walk. Without limping, half his face was numb, but his mind, that remained sharp. And he knew something Varys didn't, something Stannis didn't. Jaime Lannister was not in King's Landing when it fell. He was riding back from the Riverlands with a small force, too late to stop the invasion, but not too late to plan his vengeance. Word of Cersei's execution reached him at night, by firelight, from a filthy, crow-carrying squire. Jaime didn't weep. He sat in silence for hours. Then he mounted his horse, turned to his men, and said, "We ride to Casterly, Robb. We end this from home." The lion was wounded, but it was not dead, and in the north something older and colder stirred. Bran Stark, beyond the wall, felt the flames of the south, but dreamed only of snow, of wings, of darkness creeping slowly beneath the earth. The fall of King's Landing meant little to the dead. They waited for no king. Not Stannis, not Robb, not anyone. The wheel had broken, yes, but what rose in its place might be worse than anything that came before. Snow fell softly over Casterly Rock. The wind off the sunset sea howled like a beast denied its prey, but Jaime Lannister didn't flinch. He stood at the edge of the cliffside balcony, golden hand clenched, eyes narrowed on the horizon where the sea met sky. Behind him, the halls of his house were colder than he'd ever known them, not for lack of fire, but from what had been lost. Cersei was dead. His sister, his lover, the woman he had killed for, lied for, fought for, and now she was gone, not from sickness or age, but by the sword of a man who called himself just. Stannis Baratheon. Jaime had always hated him, but now that hate had a purpose, it became the kind of hate that doesn't fade with time. It grows, festers, turns into something sharper than any blade. Sir Keevan stood beside him, aging, tired, loyal. "The men are restless," he said. "They've lost faith in King's Landing. They say the lion has lost its roar." Jaime turned to him. "Then we remind them that a lion's roar is loudest before it kills." Kevan nodded. "The Tyrells are willing to talk." Jaime's face twisted. "Talk? Or beg for protection now that they've lost their way to the throne?" "Both." "So be it," Jaime thought. Alliances made of desperation often spilled the most blood, and he intended to drown the Iron Throne in it. Meanwhile, back in King's Landing, the Red Keep felt less like a palace and more like a temple now. Tapestries of lions were torn down, replaced with black stags and flames. Melisandre's influence deepened. Priests of R'hllor walked the streets, whispering prophecies and lighting candles that never seemed to burn out. Stannis sat the Iron Throne each day, hearing pleas from lords and peasants alike. But he heard them all the same way, coldly, as obstacles between him and peace. He refused to forgive, refused to negotiate with the Westerlands, refused to release Sansa Stark, though he claimed she was safe. He even refused to crown himself with pomp, saying only, "I am king. I need no coronation to know it." But something began to stir even among his own rank. Sir Davos, Seaworth saw it first, the way Melisandre spoke to Sansa in riddles, the way she ordered soldiers to guard the dungeons more heavily, and the strange glow that came from the underground chambers at night. She has plans, Davos muttered to himself one evening, and they don't include us. His worry deepened when he saw what they'd done to Gendry, the bastard son of Robert Baratheon. Melisandre had found him, hidden in the city by Varys, and dragged him before Stannis like a prize. The boy begged, but the flames took him anyway. His screams echoed through the halls for hours. "His king's blood was needed," she said. "The war for the dawn is coming." Davos didn't sleep that night. He packed a small satchel. He made quiet preparations, because if Melisandre intended to burn more children in the name of prophecy, he wouldn't let her choose the next one. In the north, Robb Stark sat at the edge of the Godswood in River Run, letters in hand. News from the south told of fire, war, and shattered houses. But news from the Wall chilled him more. Jon Snow had written to him. The letter was short, but urgent. Wildlings had gathered in massive numbers, far more than any ranger had seen before. But worse, they were being
followed by things that didn't die, White Walkers.
The long night. Robb wanted revenge, yes, for Ned, for Catelyn, for Winterfell. But now he had to ask himself, what was the point of a crown if the world itself turned to snow and death? He called his bannermen. We march north, he said, to war, to prepare for it. And still, deep in the dungeons of King's Landing, Tyrion Lannister sat, half-broken, but alive. Varys visited him with soft footsteps and soft words. You could escape, you know. I have ships, gold, friends. Tyrion looked at the wall. And go where? The world hates Lannisters now. Not the right parts of the world, Varys said with a thin smile. There are those across the sea who admire cleverness, who understand.
Revenge. Tyrion turned, finally looking him in the eye. What are you saying? I'm saying it's time we started building something new. Far from here, far from kings. Tyrion leaned back, eyes dark. Then let's burn the game board.
Ship rocked gently in the bay just beyond King's Landing, its sails furled, its name hidden. A small, sleek vessel, too quiet for trade, too quick for war. Inside its hold, Tyrion Lannister sat cloaked in grey, the sea breeze biting at his healing face. Half of his vision remained blurred, the scar on his cheek stiff and burning, when the wind caught it wrong, but he was alive, and more importantly, he was free. Varys stood beside him as the vessel began to drift out into open waters.
Essos awaits, the spider whispered. And with it, people who might still listen to a Lannister. If he speaks with golden venom, not pride. Tyrion scoffed, though his voice was softer now. Gold is running dry. Venom, though? I've got
barrels. He turned his gaze back to the receding coastline of Westeros. Smoke still curled from the city's towers, and from the docks he could just make out the Red Keep. A shadow on the hill.
A symbol of everything lost. He didn't know where he would go, Volantis, Pentos, Meereen. All he knew was that he needed time. And something darker than time. Purpose. He poured himself a drink and whispered to no one in particular. The Lannisters always pay their debts, and mine are long overdue. Back in the Riverlands, Jaime Lannister met with Olenna Tyrell beneath the ancient weirwood tree of an abandoned sept. It was an insult to the gods to hold council there, but Olenna never cared much for gods. "I'll
be plain with you, Sir Jaime," she said, eyes sharp despite her age. "Your sister was a wretched queen, but Stannis is worse. He's no king, he's a butcher with a god whispering in his ear." Jaime didn't argue. "I didn't come to defend Cersei, I came to rebuild what's left." Olenna smiled faintly. "And what is left?" "Me," Jaime said simply, "and a name that still makes men hesitate before drawing steel." The Tyrells had lost nearly everything when Joffrey died and Stannis took the city. Their ambitions were crushed, but their hunger wasn't. Olenna agreed to an alliance on one condition. "Let me place the next queen," she said. "Not for love, for legacy." Jaime nodded. I don't care who sits beside me, I only care who kneels before me. In the north, the air turned colder than usual for the season. Jon Snow stood atop the wall, eyes fixed on the tree line beyond. Ghost paced below, growling low at the wind. Sam stood beside him, shivering. "There's something out there," Jon muttered. "It's not just wildlings." "They don't move like wildlings," Sam added, "and they don't bleed like men." The Night's Watch had grown thin, too few brothers, too many graves. Even Castle Black looked more like a tomb than a stronghold. But the ravens Jon sent south received no answers. Not from Stannis, not from Robb, not from anyone. Jon feared they'd already lost, that no king cared for a war without thrones. Back at King's Landing, Melisandre stood in the blackened sept, now converted into a temple of Aralor. The statue of the Seven had been melted, reshaped into a blazing heart, surrounded by candles that never burned down. She whispered to herself in High Valyrian, her voice dancing like smoke. Beside her stood Sansa Stark, dressed in crimson, her
eyes distant but not broken. "She resists," Melisandre said aloud. "She mourns," Stannis replied behind her, arms folded. "She will serve," the Red Woman said, her fingers brushing Sansa's wrist.
"There is more to her blood than she knows. She carries the gift of shadow. I've seen it, in flame, in dream." Sansa didn't speak. She was learning now how to survive, how to play this new game where fire ruled instead of gold. But a spark of something colder had ignited inside her. Something hardened by years of betrayal. She looked at Stannis and for the first time since her captivity spoke with intent. "My brother rides for the north. He will not forget me." Stannis narrowed his eyes. "Let him come." Melisandre smiled. "He will come, and when he does, he will kneel or burn." In the far north, beyond the wall, Bran Stark walked through snowdrifts that weren't real. Not anymore. He was dreaming, seeing through the eyes of crows, wolves, and trees. He watched the world unravel from above, detached, quiet, and what he saw chilled even his dream self. Thousands of figures marching through the forest.
Not men, not living, and behind them, something darker, taller, older. He woke, gasping. Mira Reed clutched his arm. "What did you see?" Bran's voice cracked. "The dead are marching! The ship carrying Tyrion Lannister reached Pentos under."
Cover of night, docking quietly at a private pier owned by Illyrio Mopatis, the same wealthy merchant who once helped Daenerys Targaryen begin her rise. Tyrion stepped off the gangplank cloaked in foreign silk, but his limp and scars gave him away to those who had long memories and sharp eyes. Illyrio greeted him with false warmth and real curiosity. "A Lannister in exile," he said, smiling, as his servants poured sweet wine. "What strange music the world now plays." Tyrion raised his goblet. "Stranger still is the song I intend to write." He had one goal now, to destroy Stannis Baratheon and whatever holy madness ruled the
Iron Throne.
But to do that he needed someone bigger than himself, someone with armies, dragons, and a reason to hate kings. He needed Daenerys Stormborn. "But she's gone from Meereen," Illyrio said, stroking his beard. "Left on Dragonback, no one knows where." Tyrion leaned back. "Then we find her, or we make ourselves too important for her to ignore." He began to write letters that night, dozens of them, letters to sellsword companies, to exiled lords, to enemies of Stannis hiding in the free cities. He promised gold, revenge, and chaos. And in the darkness of his chamber he whispered to himself, "If I cannot be a lion in Westeros, I will be the flame that burns it down." In the north, Robb Stark and his army marched toward the wall, but the road was not easy. Snow began to fall too early, their rations stretched thin. The lords grumbled. Some questioned the need to ride north at all. We should take River Run.
Or march on the rock while they're wounded, Lord Karstark growled one evening by the campfire. My brother sits at the wall, Robb said firmly. If he says death is marching, then it is. I will not win a crown if there's no realm.
Left to rule, but he didn't say what haunted him in secret. Dreams of a pale blue sky cracking open and shadows crawling over fields of ice. Dreams where wolves howled and no one answered. At night he clutched Grey Wind's fur tightly, trying to drown out the cold crawling into his bones, not the cold of snow, but the cold of fate. In King's Landing, fires still burned every night, not from rebellion, but from ritual. Melisandre had begun burning prisoners beneath the Red Keep, thieves, rapists, some guilty, some not. She claimed it was to cleanse the city's soul, but Stannis' silence grew heavier with each flame. Davos Seaworth finally confronted him. "This isn't justice," he said, voice hoarse. "It's madness in the name of a god." Stannis turned slowly, eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights. "Madness? You call me mad," said Davos. "I call you lost," Davos said softly. "The Iron Throne isn't worth your soul." But Melisandre appeared in the doorway, silent, glowing, like a fire made flesh. "You speak of souls, Onion Knight, but you do not see the war beyond the walls. The true enemy comes with no crown." Stannis looked at them both and said nothing. But that night Davos vanished from the city. Some say he was imprisoned. Others say he was killed. Only a few whispered that he escaped and carried something important with him. A girl with black hair and a secret name, Shireen. Far to the east, Daenerys Targaryen flew over mountains and wastelands on Drogon's back, no longer the queen of Meereen, but something more primal. She had seen what mercy had cost her. Her people turned on her, her council betrayed her, and her other two dragons were chained like beasts. But now, in the wilderness, she was reborn. The Dothraki who found her knelt without question. They saw the fire in her eyes and the creature above her and knew this was not a woman. This was a storm. And when a letter reached her by raven, sealed in gold and wine-red wax with the Lion of Lannister, it did not anger her. It intrigued her. She read Tyrion's words, each one soaked in wit, spite, and blood. "You want justice."
"I want revenge. Shall we dance?" She smiled and whispered, "Let the world burn." At the wall, Jon Snow stood beside Sam as a scout returned, pale and breathless. "They're coming," the man gasped. "Thousands, maybe more." Jon nodded. "Sound the horns."
As the cold wind rose and the fires were lit, Jon turned to the blackened woods and saw them. White figures with eyes like moonlight. And behind them, on a dead horse, a tall creature of frost and silence. The Night King had come, snow-blanketed, the wall like a funeral shroud, muffling the footsteps of the living while the dead marched louder than ever in silence. Jon Snow stood atop the battlements, Longclaw clenched in frozen fingers. Below him, the Night's Watch scrambled to reinforce the gates, but their numbers were pitiful, barely 200 men, and half of them barely men at all. Children, criminals, old warriors too proud to retire. The real soldiers were bone, in the ground now. And yet Jon stood still, staring into the trees. The whites were there, thousands, maybe tens of thousands, and behind them, mounted like a king of corpses, the Night King watched, motionless, unblinking. It was as if he knew Jon was watching, knew the wall's time had come. Sam stood beside him, shaking. The fire won't last if they climb. The wall, they won't climb, Jon whispered. They'll break it. Sam looked at him like he'd lost his mind. How? Jon didn't know, but the truth twisted deep in his gut. This wasn't a siege. This wasn't war. This was the end of all things dressed in snow and silence. South of the wall, Robb Stark and his army marched hard, ignoring the fatigue, the frostbite, the constant threat of ambush. The northern lords whispered that Robb had gone mad, chasing ghost stories instead of vengeance. But as they passed abandoned villages with doors torn from their hinges, bodies curled in the snow, and children frozen mid-scream, they stopped whispering. And then they found the first survivor, a wildling girl, barely breathing. They came like wind, she muttered. Took my mother's face, wore it, called my father to her, and then tore him apart. Robb stood silent. How far behind them? He asked. She didn't speak. She only began to cry. At Casterly Rock, Jaime Lannister sharpened his sword in the war room, where golden maps now lay stained with wine and blood. The Tyrells had sent 2,000 men to support his march east, and the Freys had begun to stir, offering allegiance again with worm-tongued promises. But Jaime no longer trusted banners. He only trusted pain. They think the worst is over, he said to Kevan. Kevan shook his head.
It's not. Jaime smiled coldly. No, the worst is only beginning. He had no interest in Stannis' throne, not anymore. He wanted to see the Red Keep fall stone by stone. He wanted to break the city that had taken Cersei, that had taken
his child. And when he rode east with 20,000 men, he swore something darker than loyalty to himself. Burn it all, he whispered, echoing the mad king he once killed. Across the sea, Tyrion Lannister arrived in Meereen, now ruled by
chaos and ash.
Daenerys had left, but her name still inspired awe and terror. Daario Naharis greeted him with suspicion. What do you want, Lannister? Not your queen, Tyrion said, just her war. He moved through the city like a ghost, gathering what remained, freedmen, second sons, merchants who remembered the price of silence. And he began building a new force, not of honor or oaths, but desperation. And when a raven arrived bearing Daenerys' seal and a simple message, "Come to Valyria, come see what I've become," Tyrion smiled, wicked and weary. He was going back into fire. Again. In King's Landing, Melisandre performed her greatest ritual yet beneath the Red Keep. Hundreds gathered around, including Sansa, draped in red silk, her eyes hollow, but no longer weak. A man screamed atop the pyre, not a criminal this time, a lord, a traitor to Stannis, she claimed. His bones cracked in the flames, and the smoke rose high into the black sky, curling into something almost alive. "The Lord of Light speaks," Melisandre cried. "The enemy comes from the north, but not with swords." Sansa watched silently. Later, that night, she stood in her chamber and carved a message into the bottom of a wooden bowl with a dinner knife. "He burns everyone." She handed it to a servant she trusted. "Get this to my brother. If you die trying, so be it, but make sure someone reads it." Far beyond Meereen, across jagged mountains and haunted waters, Daenerys stood barefoot on the blackened stone of old Valyria. Drogon circled high above, his wings casting massive shadows over ruins that hadn't seen life in centuries. But Daenerys wasn't alone. Dozens of exiled Targaryen loyalists had followed her into the ruins. Some said she was mad, others said she was chosen. And when she knelt before a cracked, ancient altar and spilled her own blood across the stone, they all watched in reverence or terror. "I am not your queen," she said. "I am fire reborn. The world has forgotten what it means to be a Targaryen." Her eyes blazed, not with rage, but something deeper. A hunger to cleanse the world in fire. They will remember. And in the skies above, Drogon roared so loud the sea shook. Smoke rose from the trees beyond the wall, not from fire, but from decay. Jon Snow stood at the gates of Castle Black, every muscle tense, heart pounding like a war drum. The horns had sounded 3 times, not once,
Not twice. 3. The dead were here. The first wave came silently like shadows moving through the snow, not charging, not shouting, just advancing, hundreds of them, then thousands, limping, crawling, running. Their eyes glowed faintly in the
dark. Former men, former women, now husks of bone and rot and ice. Jon shouted, "Archers!" Flaming arrows rained down, lighting the field in small flickers of hope. Some wights fell, most didn't. The fire slowed them, but it couldn't stop them. The Night King stood behind the chaos, still as a statue carved from frost. When he raised one pale hand, the ground itself seemed to groan, and then something worse happened. A cracking sound, like the world splitting open, shook the wall. Sam fell to his knees. No, 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 no. A great beast emerged from the blizzard behind the wights, an undead giant. Its eyes burned blue, chains dragged behind its limbs, and it walked, like winter itself, slow, steady, unstoppable. Jon swallowed his fear and called to the brothers of the watch, "Hold the line for the realm of men." But deep inside he knew the wall wouldn't hold much longer. Robb Stark saw the glow from leagues away. Atop a hill outside Molestown, he and his army watched a faint, unnatural light bloom above the forest near the wall. It was no sunrise. One of his scouts returned, face pale as death. They broke the gates, a giant with dead eyes, their inside castle black. Robb clenched his jaw, his wolf pacing beside him. "Then we march now, no rest, but—"
"The men," Lord Manderley protested. "Now!" Robb roared, grey wind growling with him. The king in the north had arrived too late once before.
He would not repeat history, not again. Not when Jon was up there, not when his people were already dying. And so the northern army charged into snow toward a wall that no longer stood between life and death. In King's Landing, Sansa Stark sat alone in her chamber, hands wrapped in red cloth to hide the burns from the last ritual. Melisandre had forced her to bless the flame, to speak words in High Valyrian she barely understood, words that made her throat bleed. But Sansa was
no longer afraid. She had seen what this city had become, a temple of smoke and screams.
Stannis sat like a ghost on the Iron Throne, his flesh thinner each week, as if the power he'd stolen was draining him. And Melisandre? She ruled without needing a crown. One night Sansa stood by a window staring north. She whispered, "Jon."
"I'm still here." A soft knock at her door broke the silence. It was the servant boy, trembling, eyes wide. They're burning the dungeons tonight. All of them." Sansa stood slowly, her heart frozen. "Take me there."
Tyrion arrived in Valyria 3 days later, his boat guided through fog and smoke by men who refused to speak. He saw her before she saw him, Daenerys, standing amid ash and ruin, wearing a cloak made from Drogon's shed scales. Her hair had grown wild, her face held no kindness. "You came," she said, not with joy, but with expectation. "I never could resist a powerful woman with an army and a temper," Tyrion replied. She studied him. "Why now?" He held up a scroll, worn, blood-stained, sealed with the stark direwolf. "Because the dead are walking, and if we don't move—"
"Now they'll rule everything." Dany stepped closer. "And if I help?" "Then you take what's yours. Fire and blood," she smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that." Behind them, Drogon landed with a thunderous crash. Rhaegal flew above, his green wings carving through the mist. The dragons were ready, and now so was their queen. At Castle Black, the final gate splintered under the undead giant's fist. Jon fought like a man already dead, Longclaw slicing.
Through rotten flesh, his arms numb, legs shaking, men screamed, fire roared, and above it all the horns sounded one last time, not 3, 4, from the south. Robb Stark burst through the woods with his army at his back, grey wind charging beside him, a wolf of vengeance and fury. The north had arrived. Stark, the Geats soldiers roared, smashing into the whites from behind. Jon saw him, his brother, his king. For a moment, the dead were pushed back. For a moment, hope returned. And then the Night King raised his hand. Again, the fallen, both sides, began to rise, and the snow turned red once more. That's part 7 done. The wall is broken. The dead have breached the realm of men, and Daenerys is ready to unleash her dragons. The Great War has begun. Should I finish with part 8? The final part. This is where it all ends. You said yes, ChatGPT said ash fell like snow across the ruins of Castle Black. Bodies lay in mounds, men, whites, brothers of the Night's Watch, northern soldiers, all twisted together in death, and yet not all of them stayed dead. When the Night King raised his hand once more, dozens of fallen warriors began to twitch, then rise, groaning as blue light flooded their eyes. Jon Snow collapsed to one knee, blood soaking through his cloak. Longclaw felt heavier than ever. The cold wasn't just outside him now, it was in his bones. He watched as one of his own, a young boy he'd trained at Castle Black, shambled toward him, arms stiff, eyes glowing. But before the thing reached him, a blur of grey tore through its chest. Grey wind. Robb's direwolf lunged through the smoke, jaws snapping, ripping the creature apart. Robb followed close behind, sword in hand, his face wild with fury. "Jon!" he shouted, grabbing his brother by the shoulder. Jon blinked up at him like he'd forgotten how to breathe. "You came." Robb nodded once. "We're not done yet." Together they rose. Far away, in King's Landing, the fires burned hotter than ever. Melisandre stood atop the steps of the great sept, now a temple of Rulla draped in scarlet, her eyes glowing with something not entirely human anymore. "Winter has come," she told the crowd of terrified nobles and loyalists, "but fire will answer, fire will cleanse." Behind her, the dungeons were aflame. Sansa Stark, her face covered in soot and grief, turned away from the smoke curling into the sky. She had watched too many burn. She would watch no more. Later that night, she slipped into the royal wing, a dagger wrapped in linen tucked into her sleeve. Her hand trembled, not from fear, but rage, cold, burning rage. She entered Stannis's chamber silently. He sat alone, face gaunt, eyes bloodshot. "Come to kill me, girl?" he asked without looking up. "No," Sansa whispered. "I came to—"
"Kill what's left of me!" And she plunged the blade into his chest. Stannis gasped, blood pouring from his lips.
He reached for her, but she stepped back, letting him crumple to the floor like a broken statue. When Melisandre burst through the door moments later, her scream echoed across the keep. But Sansa was already gone. In the skies above Westeros, two dragons crossed the narrow sea like shadows on fire. Drogon and Rhaegal arrived at dawn, their roars shaking the heavens. The dead army outside Castle Black looked up, and for the first time they hesitated. Daenerys Targaryen stood atop Drogon, her face lit by sunrise and vengeance. Tyrion clung behind her, wide-eyed, muttering prayers to gods he never believed.
"In! Burn them all!" she whispered. Drogon dove, fire spewing from his maw, consuming dozens of whites in a single sweep.
Rhaegal followed, his green flame scorching the ice. The snow melted, the dead screamed, but the Night King did not flinch. He raised one hand again, and from the trees emerged something worse. "Viserion," Daenerys gasped, her dead dragon, wings torn, flesh rotting, eyes blazing blue, rose into the sky with an unholy cream. The Night King had a dragon of his own. The battle that followed was not a battle. It was apocalypse. Jon and Robb fought side by side, slicing through waves of whites as snow turned to mud, then to steam. Tyrion watched from afar, helpless as the dragons clashed in the sky. Fire against ice, flame against death, Drogon and Viserion collided with deafening fury. Their roars shook the world. Blue flame met red. Flesh tore. Scales burned. The air filled with the sound of gods warring. Daenerys held tight to Drogon's back, blood streaming from her temple. She locked eyes with the Night King, riding Viserion like a phantom of frost. And then Drogon dived, straight into the heart of the dead army. Jon screamed, "Dany, no!" But she didn't hesitate. She whispered, "Dracarys." one last time, and Drogon exploded in fire. The blast lit the sky like a sun being born. The Night King and Viserion were engulfed, whites ignited by the thousands. The entire forest shook with the force of the flame. When it was over, silence fell. The Night King was gone. Viserion's corpse lay crumpled, unmoving, and Drogon was dying. Daenerys crawled from his back, burned, coughing, but alive. She looked at Jon from across the battlefield and smiled. "I ended it," she mouthed. Then she collapsed in the snow. A week later, the survivors gathered in Winterfell. Jon, Robb, Sansa, Tyrion, Davos, alive and battle-worn, Sam, Arya, returned from her own blood-soaked road. They buried Daenerys beneath a weirwood tree, her grave marked by dragonbone and black stone. The North mourned her not as a queen, but as a saviour. Tyrion said nothing at her funeral. Just drank, Robb returned, to the North, not as king, but as warden. He renounced the crown, tired of death and thrones. Jon took no title. He disappeared north of the wall, ghost at his side. Some say he went to find peace. Others say he couldn't stand to be near fire any more. Sansa ruled Winterfell, quiet, wise, cold. Tyrion vanished. Some say he took a ship east, chasing ghosts. Others whisper he's building something in the ashes of Meereen, but the war was over. The wheel wasn't just broken, it was burned.